Okay with everybody? Great, thanks, Emma. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amanda Pollock. I am the Public Affairs Officer here at Acadia. I think I know most of you all and folks online, so that's great. So the first question you're probably thinking is, why is Amanda giving this presentation? Which is a completely fair question to ask. In a previous life, I was a historian, and my area of expertise is in antebellum Black history, specifically in Boston. So that's kind of check one. And the second thing, I used to be a social studies teacher for 8th grade. So you all should be warned that I'm gonna kind of flex my educator and interpreter muscle today. And I'm not going to be doing all the talking. So I'm going to force you all to both talk to each other and talk to me. So hopefully that will make this a little bit more exciting and a little bit more interesting, and we will take it from there. But those are my warnings, so you all can get comfortable with that idea as I kind of start talking through what we're gonna be talking about today, which is Juneteenth. And so a couple of questions to keep in mind as we're going through this presentation and exercise together, that I hope will kind of tie it all together for everybody, is how do we mark important moments from the past, and who decides what moments are quote unquote important? So those are kind of the questions that I was thinking about as I was putting this all together. And hopefully those are questions that you all will be thinking about as we walk through kind of all of this. And we hopefully after you leave this presentation today, because they're intentionally not easy questions to answer. So a couple of key things just for context before we start. The language that we use when we're talking about specifically this portion of our history as Americans is really important. So what scholars are currently using to discuss people who were enslaved is exactly that, enslaved people. And that really matters here because the whole point of calling someone a slave was to strip them of their humanity. By calling them an enslaved person, that does two things. One, it makes sure that we give these people the humanity that they deserve. And two, it reminds us that they did not choose to be enslaved. They were forcibly enslaved by white Americans and the government structures that were put in place to keep them at a status below what they should have been considered. The other thing that we are not using the word master anymore. Scholars are not using the word master when they're talking about this period of history. Again, because it reinforces that power structure. I've recently been in the home market, and you may notice that they're no longer even calling it master bedrooms, they are primary bedrooms. So we're starting to see this shift kind of transcend just talking about the past, which is really cool. But we call these people enslavers because that is what they did. They enslaved people. Exactly how this works. So just some context. So if you hear those and as you start talking about these things, totally fine if you fall into old habits, but trying to make that active shift is really important as we talk about such a complicated subject. So usually when we're talking about Juneteenth, we're talking about this idea of emancipation from the institution of slavery. And something that people ask me all the time in my previous life is, well, when did emancipation happen? And not shockingly, that's a really complicated question to answer because it really depends on where we're talking about. So first of all, there's a real big difference between legal emancipation and people emancipating themselves. From the moment slavery started, people began to emancipate themselves, which is where the Underground Railroad began, which is another kind of call to my previous life. But people started escaping from slavery the moment that they were enslaved. And the roots of the Underground Railroad, they don't really fall in that pre-Civil War time period. They go all the way back to the 1600s when people first started to escape from slavery. So that's really important to note that people were always choosing to emancipate themselves throughout this entire history. The other thing is that Emancipation Days have been celebrated both nationally and internationally at various times throughout the year. So in Massachusetts, when we established, sorry, I say we because I'm from Massachusetts, but when Massachusetts signed, yeah, right. When Massachusetts signed their first state constitution in 1780, they abolished slavery right there and then legally. And that's an important distinction we'll get to in just a minute. And so the free Black community living in Boston has been having Freedom Day celebrations since 1781. We also know in Maryland, they abolished slavery in 1864, which is when Maryland started having their Emancipation Days, and they still celebrate Emancipation Day in November. So that's important to note as well. Slavery was not uniquely an American thing. So the Great Britain is a great example. That whole regime enslaved individuals. So Trinidad and Tobago, which is a colony of Great Britain, they started celebrating their Emancipation Day in 1838. And it became a national holiday in 1965. And so they've also kind of started having this rebirth of Emancipation Days, not just in the United States, but internationally as well. So we're gonna give the Civil War in 30 seconds, which is really hard to do, as Brandon can back me up on. The baseline thing that is really important for this conversation is that slavery was the main cause of the American Civil War. So that's really key to this whole conversation. The Civil War actively began when Confederate or when Southerners, they tried to establish their own government. And they tried to operate as their own sovereign government from the United States. When shots were fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, the Civil War officially began, and this group of rebels actively began insurrection against the government of the United States. They were never recognized by any other nation as their own sovereign government, which is really important to note. So they really truly were just trying to have an insurrection against the United States government, which is important, again, framing for this conversation. So people continued to emancipate themselves throughout the American Civil War. And then in 1863, as a way to kind of turn the tide of the Civil War, Lincoln decided that he was going to create this document called the Emancipation Proclamation. The idea behind this document is once the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, that all enslaved people in the United States should be free. Now, again, important to note, Confederate states didn't see themselves as part of the United States in that time. So people continued to enslave people throughout that second half of the Civil War. I also think it's important to note that Lincoln didn't do this out of the benevolence of his heart. The whole first 2 years of the war were kind of a hot mess express for the US Army. They really weren't doing good. They had lost a lot of soldiers. And at that point in time, Black soldiers were not allowed to enlist in the United States Army. They were allowed to enlist during the American Revolution. They were not allowed to enlist in any war going forward from that point forward, which is really interesting. So as we're losing the majority of white men who are allowed to enlist in that United States Army, Lincoln's kind of looking at himself and he's saying, well, don't really know what I'm going to do if we can't let Black soldiers go ahead and enlist in this conflict. So that's the other really key thing that the Emancipation Proclamation does, is it allows for Black men to enlist in that US Army. So again, there's a portion of him, he never really is clear about his stance on abolition or equality throughout his lifetime, but really important to note that he's doing this, and there's that third side of him that really wants to make sure that he can have that army filled with other soldiers that aren't just white men, because he needs human beings at that point. Okay, so 1865, Civil War is over. We have a national park that is there to memorialize this. This is my first park. It has always had a special place in my heart. So at Appomattox Courthouse, General Grant sits down with Robert E. Lee. They sign a surrender document, not a perfect surrender document, but they ultimately create parole passes for some of these Confederate soldiers, and they immediately start sending soldiers home. This is also really important because the armies begin to start to dissolve themselves. Now, we just went through a major conflict where not all people are seeing eye to eye. So to remove your main source of enforcement from the South at that point is going to be really, really complicated. And that is where we are going to pick up. In the Trans-Mississippi Theater, there had been especially a lot of problems trying to enforce anything that came out of those surrender documents for multiple reasons. One, because of all of the troubles that were going on as a result of the end of the Civil War, people not being thrilled with the end of the Civil War, trying to figure out who's in charge, how are we going to treat Confederate soldiers who were insurrectionists, Are we gonna send them all to jail? Are we going to allow them to run for Congress? There's all of these big questions that are kind of starting this idea of how are we gonna approach the Reconstruction movement. But they are also, especially in Texas, having major conflicts result in the Texas-Mexico border. So you have this huge problem going on in the Texas-Mexico border at the same time. So US government decides they're gonna send some soldiers down there to try and figure out what's going on, try and increase that level of enforcement of those surrender terms, that surrender document. Which leads us to the document of the day. So as a part of this, when Major General Gordon Granger, which is a mouthful, shows up in Galveston, Texas, he realizes that a lot of the enslavers had not been allowing the people that they enslaved to get paid for their labor. They were not following through on this major component of the end of the American Civil War, which is that people are going to be free from this point forward. So he puts forward this general order number 3, which is the document you see in front of you. So this is the first time you all are going to have to talk to each other. I'm going to pause and I'm going to have you all read this document. I've transcribed it on the back. For the folks who are here virtually, you are going to get a chat with a link to this. In the 5th paragraph, you'll see that transcription in that little web page, which is great. You all can read that there. Emma is going to try and set up some breakout rooms for you all online. And you all are going to talk a little bit about the things that stick out to you in these things. You all are going to do that in person. So we're going to take a couple minutes. You can read this and then find a partner. And you're going to talk through just about the things that stick out to you. You don't need to be an expert. These can be questions that you have. They can be things that you find interesting. These can be things that confuse you. These can be things you agree with, disagree with, but you're going to go through and you're going to figure out kind of those things that stick out to you. And then we're going to come back together and have those questions. So folks online, I'm going to have you get sent into maybe a group of 2 and a group of 3. If you can do that, Emma, that'd be awesome. Maybe. And you all in here can read. If not, I'm going to go ahead and take care of that now. think we're wrapping up, and the people online are gonna come back. I think they have a couple more seconds. All right, what did you talk about?
Freedom still seems to me like it's still got a lot. Lot of strings attached, and like what the. We've been saying that
Say more.
And. Well, that you basically still can't go anywhere, you still have to be. We were just discussing like, what is idleness mean
Yeah.
specifically, and sort of. Basically, you still have to like, work for that former enslaver, now employer, I guess. But what does that, would get into like. I mean, there's no labor union, I'm assuming that it'd be like get equal pay or whatever, like it's sort of like. It's like, clearly, it's still not super fantastic life.
So there are several things in there that I'm gonna touch on really quick. So one of the things you pointed out was this mention of idleness, that you're not gonna be supportive of being idle, not gonna be all of that. So throughout the Reconstruction movement, the way that Black people were depicted in the popular media is pretty disgusting. And a lot of it is people who are, political artists are creating these images where Black Americans are looking as if they are animals. They're looking as if they're lazy. They're trying to paint this image of the lazy Black man, which forages a lot of what happens in the modern civil rights movement that's going on. But they're already, you can see kind of that origin, that fear that, well, if we're releasing all of the Black individuals who were enslaved, if we're just letting them kind of go out into the wild, well, aren't they not gonna work? Are they gonna be lazy? Are they not gonna do anything? Like, if we don't have that threat of enslavement, are they going to contribute to society? Because we don't think they can contribute to society. So how's that gonna work? So that's really important. And then you were also talking about this freedom, right? How are we going to see freedom of press? We can tell that we're still not quite there. So what does that really look like, right? So that's, I think, a really important note too. John.
I think there's a measured advice. I mean, advice is pretty loose, but given the situation, what I think there was the idea was that this is a transition, that for now, if you leave where you are, there's not going to be help or anything any better. So I'm sort of managing the situation as a first step. Like, where do you go from here?
So that's a really great point. And that's, I think, one of the things that I made sure that I highlighted for myself to talk about this advice to remain quietly, which really gets me, but we'll talk about that in a second, at their present homes and work for wages. So one of the things that you hear a lot in this lost cause narrative about the happy slave narrative, that people were happy being enslaved, they were happy. One of the things that they cite as evidence of that happy slave narrative, now when I say that happy slave narrative, do we know what I'm mentioning? Or is that foreign to people? Okay, so in the 1990s, you see kind of this rebirth of this Southern power movement is probably the best way to try and explain it. And one of the things that people were citing is the way that what made slavery okay, or what made that fighting for the Civil War on behalf of slavery okay. They tried to construct this narrative that, well, enslaved people were happy being enslaved because they had their food taken care of for them. They had enslavers who cared about them. They had their medical needs taken care of, all of those things. We know that's not true in reality, because we have documentation and oral histories now that very much disprove that entire narrative, that people were not happy being enslaved, but there's this power structure that keeps people enslaved throughout this whole time period. Now, this is directly telling people to stay at their home. Even if they want to leave, now they have the US government, the US Army, who is here in their backyard to enforce this proclamation, telling them to stay at home, which adds another level to that, again, that happy slave narrative of them just staying quietly and present in their homes. Because once again, the US government is trying to dictate where they can and can't go. We also know that people, again, left and they went further west. This is when you start to see a huge movement of African Americans to the West Coast. You see there's a whole lot of different things going on with migration at this time period that's really interesting. Could write an entire thesis on that. Really fun. So yes, Thank you for pointing that out. I like to talk about that too. What else did we talk about? Back up.
Catherine actually brought up something very simple that I didn't realize, but they talk about the master and slaves, but they only talk about the slaves' actions and like freed people, but they don't mention anything about the masters and the enslavers, which I thought was interesting. I don't know if you want to understand.
Well, the advice is only for the free, the advice
Yeah.
isn't for the enslaver.
Which I think is also really interesting, right? Because again, who are they worried about here? Who are they trying to keep in their stead? Trying to keep African Americans in their stead. Really interesting. What else did we talk about?
We also talked about how it doesn't, it's still maintaining the structure of employer and hired labor, right? So it's not recognizing that there might be a problem with trying to preserve the existing structure and just turn people into paid labor.
Absolutely, yeah, trying to preserve that existing structure of, you know, the master and slave, the laborer, or the laborer and the employer, really interesting. Also, they were not employed, they were enslaved, key major difference there.
I thought it was interesting that it specifically talks about equality of personal rights and rights of property. And then tells them to stay right where they are in land that they don't own, under protection that they don't have. And that they will not be assisted by the government, as that little end note, we're not gonna help you, but stay where you are. You
Yeah,
have
stay where you
rights,
are.
But don't use them.
Yeah, that's a totally great point, I have nothing to add to that.
As I said, there's sort of a dichotomy between the language you have in bold and the absolute equality of personal rights and the rights of property. And then, you know, but advised to remain at home and that kind of thing. And so there's just the contrast between those two things. And so there's like this like that first part is sort of aspirational perhaps. And then the second part is like practical of like, how's this gonna work?
Yeah, I really appreciate that, calling out that, you know, we're not all equal right now. And will we ever be? Not quite sure. But a couple of you know have pointed out this rights of property, which I think is really important. Because again, people who were enslaved were thought of as property for a really long time. So they specifically call out the property rights component of this to, again, try and be telling the people who were enslavers at one point in time that they're not the only ones with rights to property anymore. These people who used to be enslaved are not property, and they have the right to own property now. Which is a really interesting dichotomy that didn't exist prior to the end of the American Civil War. But none of you have picked up on the one thing with Juneteenth that is so interesting to me. Because this
Texas?
is something,
Yeah.
Texas.
Actually, who did mention that? I just didn't forget.
Good job.
Deal.
Okay, the people of Texas, this is not a document that is targeted at the entire United States. They are only calling out Texas for not following the rules. Other states weren't following the rules either. They were only calling this out because Major General Gordon was down in Texas trying to quell other things. And he notices this and puts out this document, right? But I'm gonna point out a couple of other things. Two other states that were specifically not following instructions, Kentucky. Kentucky was just kind of a hot mess throughout the entire Civil War. It was a border state. And so it didn't really fall into the federal government, didn't really fall into the Confederate government. So nobody really knew what to do with it. And Lincoln really didn't want Kentucky to secede. There was a huge movement there of people who were ready to secede, and they had been kind of on the brink the entire 4 years. So as he sees Kentucky breaking the rules throughout the entire Civil War, he just kind of takes a really laissez-faire approach to it. So Kentucky doesn't end up ratifying the 13th Amendment until 1976. Other really cool, like not cool.
1976?
1976. Yes, you heard me right, not a typo. Hot Mess Express. The other state that was really bad with all of this was Delaware. Delaware never seceded. And I think Delaware, people think of Delaware as a northern state, but again, it's this border state. In the 1860 census, which is the last full and complete census prior to the American Civil War, 1,900 people were enslaved in Delaware. So there's active institution of slavery going on there. And those still enslaved were not really free when the whole thing happened on June 19th. Because again, this is specific to Texas. So we still have this really weird thing happening in Delaware with people still kind of being enslaved, still not really being enslaved. And we still have several states and several places throughout the country where you still have this active institution of slavery still going on. Slavery is abolished in the entire United States with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which doesn't happen until 1867. Okay, so we have Texas, this thing going on in 1860, did I get that, you're right, 1865, great. This happens in 1865, and then 1867, we have it for real abolished for good in the entire United States, okay? Couple quick notes, Delaware also doesn't ratify the 13th Amendment right away. They rejected it in February of 1865, and they ultimately ratified it in 1901. Okay.
She's going to be.
Yes, sorry. Not yes, no, sorry about that.
Herman's cousin over there.
I should clarify that. Okay, so this is Juneteenth. So Juneteenth is really exclusively for quite a bit a Texas thing. Because it happens in Galveston, the very first celebration of Juneteenth happens in Galveston in 1866. But this is really a uniquely Texas holiday for quite some time. This image that you see, am I still sharing my screen, Emma? That's
Yes.
Am I? Thank
Yes.
you. Okay. So, after the American Civil War, more or less understandably, a lot of the Black population is located in the south of the United States. Because that's where you see the majority of Black individuals living because of enslavement and the institution of slavery, okay? This all starts to change as Reconstruction's happening, first of all, because Jim Crow laws happen and all of that good stuff. But then you also see, at the birth of the First and Second World War, this quote unquote great migration of African Americans leaving the South and going to industrial centers in mostly the North, Chicago, Boston, New York City, to try and find a job where they're not going to be taken advantage of the same way in the South. They also have kind of this image of the North as a racial mecca where all people are actually being treated equally. They arrive and find out that's really not true, and that's a whole other presentation in itself, okay? So as people migrate, they bring their customs and their traditions and their holidays with them. So you start to see this idea of Juneteenth being celebrated as this Freedom Day. And again, Freedom Days are being celebrated at various different times, internationally, nationally, throughout time. You start to see this celebration of Juneteenth move to other states in the United States. People then, they continue to build families, they continue to build communities, they continue to share their customs, and eventually you see Juneteenth kind of being celebrated in African-American communities more throughout the United States. Which brings us to today, okay? So this image that you see on the left is an image of one of the first Juneteenth celebrations in Galveston, Texas in 1866. And this is a photo from a Juneteenth parade that happened in Washington, DC in, when did I first give this presentation? In 2022, okay? And the National Archives has a Juneteenth celebration full collection now where they are actively trying to collect documents and records of the celebrations of Juneteenth throughout time, going from whenever they first see them and to whatever records are donated to today. And they send out photographers to go and capture those celebrations throughout time. So we had Juneteenth be named as a national holiday for us here in the United States, which is why you have tomorrow off of work. And you start to see this become a more national holiday for folks in the United States, despite its origins being this really Texas-focused holiday for this group of people, this community celebrating their own freedom. Okay, which brings us to my second essential question. Who decides how we mark important moments from the past? Okay, for a while, Juneteenth was celebrated in communities, and now we've decided collectively as a culture that it's an important holiday to celebrate nationally. The president has decided that it's an important moment to celebrate nationally. So who decides? what's important and what's not important. Okay? I'm gonna have you guys break back into groups. And if you can, I think there's only one group left, actually, Emma, you can get them started online. But I want you to think about moments in your own life that you have marked as important, that your family has marked as important. Or maybe that you have celebrated, maybe things that you've noticed, maybe things that you've saved. How do you in your own life choose what moments are important to mark? Okay, and does that question make sense? What I'm looking for? Okay, this one's gonna be quick, so like, we're gonna give like 2 minutes just to kind of spark some conversation. And if you talk to somebody that you didn't talk to last time, even better, so maybe switch it up a little bit, okay? And if not, I'll live, so.
Funny.
Yeah. They're fine.
Okay, yeah, so we have these religious holidays that are kind of established. Christmas is set up on kind of a funky day. If you've had any history of Christianity classes, you probably know that, but if not, talk to me about that later. Right, so we have these religious holidays, some things that churches or maybe religious organizations come say, yep, important day, remember these, cool, great.
Only of the religious holidays, Christmas is the only one that's federally observed one for
Ah,
getting off work.
isn't that interesting? Okay, I love that observation. Who? Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples' Day, right? Who decides that?
Well, they haven't decided that, it's still Columbus Day
Who's
for
that?
the federal government,
That's a great-
Congress. The same
Congress?
Congress that decided Juneteenth still has Columbus Day.
Interesting.
right?
All right, what about some of these more personal things that you all were talking about? I heard a couple mentioned, I heard parents, I heard a couple of things. Go ahead.
I think it's like marking when people like start growing up or have grown up, like the first day you go to college, when you first lose a tooth, the tooth fairy comes, special things like that.
Okay. What else?
We were talking about how like, so, or holidays can kind of signify a change.
Say more.
Just like something like a shift from what was previously known, like we were saying, like maybe somebody's birthday, or like. We were also talking about 9/11, how everything kind of changed after that.
It's not necessarily a positive or happy change, but a change that happened.
The 9/11 example is really interesting, because there's not a holiday to mark 9/11. But I think we would all agree that 9/11 is an important moment from the past. Okay? So that change between something was very distinctly existed before and after, that, you know, that is a very clear marking of something that might be important. Anything else?
Some days like that are fading, because when I was younger, December 7th and June 6th were, everyone knew what those dates were. How many people know how, you know, my kids don't know what those dates are. And so 9/11, we all know what those dates are, but in 50, 75 years.
Love where you're going with that.
I mean, Pearl Harbor was, you know, arguably even bigger than 9/11, where it was.
Sure, yeah. So keep going. So what makes, so you said that they're fading. So why is that an important day, John, to remember?
Which one?
Pick
Any
both.
of those?
Yeah.
There are momentous changes, there are life changing for many of us, well, really all of us.
Yeah. Okay, so one thing that I'm hearing from both of these people, and I'm gonna use that as a point to transition so that we can stay on time, is one of the things that we use to mark these important dates, and I heard Brandon say this eloquently, so I'm gonna steal your words, are things that you don't want to forget. Okay, 9/11, definitely don't want to forget that day. Pearl Harbor, which is a holiday, don't want to forget that day. Your anniversary, you really don't want to forget that day, as someone who's forgotten it before. It's not fun, not a good thing, right? So these important things that you don't want to forget is really important. And I think something that people don't realize is what people don't want to forget is very different sometimes in cultures. And some person may have a lot of value for an object or a building that other people might look at and say that that's actual garbage. And so when we're thinking about what gets donated to archives or what people are trying to preserve, those things that people don't want to forget is really different from person to person, which leads to like this idea of like, well, how do we get these records from the past? How do we figure out what happened in the past? Who's donating their objects to archives? Who trusts archives to actually take care of those objects in a way that's meaningful? And that distrust of archives and historic preservation as a whole has led to a lot of racism in the archives, if we're being frank. Which leads me to this object, okay? This is one of my favorite artifacts of all time. It's such a really cool story. This is the first, so Harriet Tubman, we all know Harriet Tubman, I hope. When Harriet Tubman like starts having biographies written about her, she starts giving oral histories of what her life was as an enslaved person. She talked about this first time that she tried to escape with her two brothers, but we could find no documentary evidence of that until a gentleman who owns a historic site down on the eastern shore of Maryland went dumpster diving. Because this house behind him was throwing out all of these priceless antiques. And he wanted some of those antiques, so he got permission to go into the dumpster. And he said, all right, go ahead, have a field day. And he pulls out this huge pile of newspapers. And he's like, well, this might have something interesting to know, might as well. He's flipping through and he finds the ad put out by Harriet Tubman's first enslaver saying that she escapes with her two brothers. Harriet Tubman is Minty. Araminta was her first name. Minty was what they called her on the plantation. She chooses the name Harriet Tubman later in her life, okay? This wasn't in an archive. We could never find it because nobody thought it was important. Nobody thought it was worth remembering for a really long time. Today, the National Park Service takes care of this in the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Visitor Center on the eastern shore of Maryland. I
She
don't know
was
why.
fine looking. That's kind of interesting how they describe.
I'll go back to that actually. Yep.
Well, that's a
Okay.
whole other thing.
Whole other
Right,
thing.
that's another lecture. That's another presentation.
Have a field day with just fugitive slave acts, which really could be a whole other thing. Okay.
Well, and
Amanda,
This is-
can you reshare your screen?
Yup. Sorry. I'm getting real excited here.
Who put that ad out?
Her enslavers, Harriet's enslavers.
The local newspaper.
Yes.
Whatever.
Okay, all right. You also see this racism that exists in the landscapes that we have today. This architectural racism. So this building that may or may not appear on my screen. Oh my God, please work. Please work. I hate this computer. No. Oh no. Oh no. My mouse has disappeared. Well, you're gonna have to trust me that there's a building there. Maybe I can. Hold on. Like 15 minutes, I can figure this out. No, I can't. All right. There are a lot of buildings that don't exist, that used to exist, okay? So there was about to be a photograph on here of the 12th Baptist Church that used to exist in Boston. 12th Baptist Church was the heart of the free Black community. It was known as the Fugitive Slaves Church because most people who escaped from slavery ended up going to church there. Part of the abolitionist movement, you saw multiple different rallies taking place there throughout time. They go on after slavery is abolished to form a women's rights organization whose motto is all rights for all people. And that building has been torn down and turned into apartments. Okay. You also can see this structural racism throughout many places in the South. So the Rosenwald schools is a good example of that. I wish I could get this to work. Can I ask you to try and continue to talk? There, back in the late 20th, early 20th century, when African Americans were freed from enslavement, one of the major questions that faced people during the Reconstruction era is where are these individuals going to go to school? And a lot of public schools were refusing to let Black children into those schools. The way that a lot of communities tried to fix this issue was by establishing schools for children of color. So a guy whose last name was Rosenwald, he teamed up with a major philanthropist, and the two of them built 5,000 schools throughout the South to educate Black children specifically. Today, only 500 of those schools remain. The buildings, not the schools. Obviously, we have integrated education. Yes, Thursday, the National Park Service just submitted a special resource study to Congress naming the San Domingo School on the eastern shore of Maryland, which is a Rosenwald school, as a place that can be a perfect site for maybe a national park to share and preserve these histories and make sure that people can experience these stories from the past. Okay, you can't figure it out either, so it's not just me.
There's no us.
Which is good to know. Fabulous, future me problem. All right, so to kind of wrap this up, and I'll have for some time for questions. I was out with a travel reporter yesterday. This is relevant, I promise. And she asked me what my background was, and I shared my professional background with her. And she said to me, oh, well, it must be such a breath of fresh air to be in Acadia then, because everyone can connect to nature. And not everybody can connect to historic sites. And it is a breath of fresh air to be at Acadia. But I can't stop thinking about that second part of that sentence. If we're doing our job, everyone should be able to connect to historic sites. History has this power to provide people with education about what it means to be human. It teaches us empathy. It teaches us about moments from the past that maybe didn't go the way they should have. It teaches us about how we can go forward in a way that makes all of us collectively as a group of people better. And that's why it's so important that we have professional public historians at these places so that all people can feel these connections to the past. And that's really the reason why Juneteenth, being a federal holiday, is so important, because it gives people one more opportunity to see themselves in history. And that's what I'm gonna wrap up. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I could also talk about this for days, so that's kind of a dangerous thing to ask for questions.
What was the park you worked at first?
Appomattox Courthouse, National Historic Site.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Is it haunted?
so there are, famous question in every historic site I've been to, and so I'm gonna borrow an answer that I got from the wheat field. There was a gentleman who I adore, who's about this tall, and he fought in Vietnam, and he's just about the toughest old bird you'll ever meet. And he, whenever asked that question, he says, hey, I go just about anywhere, but you'll never find me in the wheat field at night. And
My old friend David Vella, who was was the acting director of the parks, was the chief ranger at Appomattox and would swear to on the Bible. And he was a religious guy that and he lived in one of the historic buildings there. You probably know which building, because you guys worked there, but that it was haunted.
yeah, I know which one you're talking about, the name is escaping me,
Anyway.
but yeah, anyway. Weird spiritual things happen, but what's important is that we talk about what did happen.
One thing that's interesting though, is that I think one of the reasons that historical sites and things like that kind of don't get as much respect as they do, is I think we have a tendency to take them for granted and think that they always are gonna be there. Because you think about like some of those time capsule type things, and when they send like all kinds of artifacts into space for other, planets and universes to find out, it's all over the map, you've got Chuck Berry recordings, you've got, cheeseburger wrappers, whatever they put in there. But as far as we're concerned, it's like, well, you don't have to worry about that right now, that's always gonna be there. And it kind of goes by the wayside, you don't think that that's ever gonna be forgotten, but society changes and their points of view changes and things go out of favor and different cultures that are once oppressed, have a better time, or it goes the other way around. And people's perspectives are different, and we just don't acknowledge that kind of stuff happens because we're too stupid.
That can be part of it. So to be completely fair, like historic sites for a really long time have done a horrible job, like interpreting the story there. Like it's very much has been geared towards like one person who likes history. And that's like very much not true. Like I can't tell you the number of battlefield sites that are like genuinely like only targeting like the older person who like has fought in a war. And like, they think that's the only entry point. I think we're starting to get better about that because there are so many entry points to talking about what it means to be human. So I think we're growing in a direction from a historical interpretation lens that is really exciting. But yeah, like, so just to be completely fair, like that's definitely a component that sits to it. And then I had a second thing to say, but I can't remember what it was. So, yeah.
I mean, do you think that there are more nature, like what you're saying, is there more people that like natural areas than there are historic areas?
No, I think I was just commenting on what this woman said, that she doesn't think all people can relate to a historic site, and that really made me upset.
When people think of national parks,
Yes,
they typically think of the Yellowstones and the Acadians, and they don't think of Independence National Historical Park or Brown v. Ward. I think if when you ask, if you ask somebody, name the 5 most important national parks, I would be willing to bet. And now some people might take those words, actually, let's rephrase it, if you said the 10 most important units of the national parks, I bet you most people would get that. Yeah, because
I mean, that's our own branding
Yeah,
issue,
it's where we
right?
started.
We don't actually call most of the historic sites national parks.
They're working on that.
The
That's
ones that
Siler.
we, the ones we do, I think it's pretty stupid. I mean, I think.
We're not biased at all, like, yeah.
No, like the Gateway Art, what used to be called, whatever it's called now. What Jefferson Expansion Memorial is now
Jefferson
Gateway.
Expansion National Memorial is.
Right, is now Gateway Arch National
Park,
Park.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think you have to, with the natural, there's a visceral connection that you can instantly take in, but the historic, you have to do some work. You gotta figure out why, this is a house, what is it about this?
It's a human interest.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting how Juneteenth became a holiday out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And I'm not a historian. I had never heard of Juneteenth until it was suddenly a federal holiday. Like, it got done in the middle of the night in a large, I think, appropriations bill. And to my knowledge, there hadn't been previous bills to designate Juneteenth introduced as into Congress. Maybe there had been. But like, it was like that. And most things take years before they become law in Congress, right? Like,
We didn't even know we had it all.
Well, it wasn't.
You know,
Didn't actually sign it until the day on.
Yes.
And so the guidance came out the day before saying the president's going to sign this, so don't go to work tomorrow.
yeah.
Maybe that was deliberate, so you would know how it felt.
And
So
he-
that's-
To get this, yeah.
Yeah.
This is the third Juneteenth federal holiday, is that right? Because the first was 2022 and 23 and 24. Is that
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's just interesting how it kind of came out of left field for me.
A lot was happening, and think about what was happening though, right before 2022, and in those years. Right, things that were happening nationally that may have sort of led to.
Prompted it, yeah.
I did put that in my notes. I just didn't talk about it because I got too excited.
I mean, for me, there's absolutely no question. We wouldn't be even having this conversation right now if it wasn't for the, racial justice movement. Whatever you reason it as, no questions, 100%.
Can I make a comment? Wasn't sure where you were gonna end on this thing, and so with some of the interactive things we were doing, talking, in the questions you presented, I was almost wondering if we were gonna go to like, so we're talking, like, this is a federal holiday, but like, what are the, like, who does it matter to? And so like, where is it, those important moments, and so I like Kevin, I've learned so much more about what Juneteenth was and what it means and translates to in the last 3 years than like ever knew. But then, so there's like, but. So I guess what, I'm happy where you went, but I was wondering if it was gonna be like, well, it's great, it's a federal holiday, but what's your connection? So whether that's because you've gone to Galveston or you've gone to a place and you've had an opportunity to find that story, or you actually are part of the communities, maybe that's generations ago, but like, and it's been kept, within that tradition. And so like, where is it important? I, for one, personally am happy that it's more of a national conversation. It has a national highlight, but understanding that it like comes from, well, it's all national, but it also has this very regional aspect to it, history.
Yeah,
this understanding
I
national
joked,
nuance.
somebody, I joked with someone that, I feel like about like Juneteenth, how I imagine like Jewish people feel on when they have Christmas off. Like, I don't have that personal connection. I've never celebrated Juneteenth. I'm an ally for folks who do, of course. But I had somebody in a social post at one of the parks that I was working at. We did a post about Kwanzaa, and a white presenting individual asked, "Can I celebrate Kwanzaa?" And which was a fun thing to write back to on social media. But my response was like, like anybody can do anything, but like know where it came from, and like understand that Kwanzaa came out of like the Black Power movement to empower African Americans to know about their culture. So like, do with that what you will.
So, another thing about holidays, you didn't ask the question of how this actually decided this, but the naming is bizarre to me.
I can explain.
Memorial Day is more, I mean, I get it's
Yeah.
Juneteenth, but it's not very descriptive as a holiday name. Memorial, Veterans Day.
The real emancipation.
And why not the date of the Emancipation Proclamation of the 13th Amendment? Why?
And I think that goes back to, like, again, what was happening right as this was happening, like, we had the murder of George Floyd, we have the murder of Breonna Taylor, we have all of these, like, racial justice movements happening in cities across the country, and that created really quick momentum for a political figure to do something in the first year of his presidency. Just interesting.
That's powerful.
Maybe, I don't know.
And then which went into effect January first, which is already holiday.
That was already taken.
No, seriously,
No, I know, that's why I'm laughing.
Don't underestimate, like, and the original Emancipation Proclamation was announced in the fall, so you, like, seriously, you already have a slew of other holidays then?
Yeah.
I mean, there's already resistance to it, right? So like, imagine if it was Black Lives Matter Day, right? Like, that wouldn't go over any better.
But I also think, so as like, so I used to be a teacher, and like, where I was teaching, 8th grade was the first year they ever had social studies. And so as social studies programs are defunded and removed from curriculum until 8th grade, which is abysmal. Like, imagine being an 8th grader and not knowing where Pennsylvania is on the map. That's pretty devastating. They're 13, by the way, just as a frame of reference. But like, you need to know a little bit about the story to get the name. If you don't know the history, you don't get the name, which again goes to why all of this is so important for people to think about, invest time in learning about. Good stuff.
So it's kind of funny, like, so Kevin just said that he didn't know about it, but apparently it had been introduced into Congress prior.
Interesting.
So is it early, I guess the first time was in 96,
Oh, really?
and according to Wikipedia. By 2016, 45 states were already observing it.
The more you know.
Whether it was, it may not have been a paid holiday, but we're observing it as a holiday. And some 18 states observe it as a paid holiday.
Thank you, Abe.
And so it's like, and it's interesting
Didn't come out of nowhere.
that it didn't come out of nowhere, but we
Still didn't know.
didn't know about it. Like stuff was happening, but it wasn't making the news that we
Right.
consumed,
Right.
or at least that I consumed.
In the
Like Kevin
Northeast, in the Northeast.
Yeah, I was gonna send define we, right?
Yeah,
Like,
right.
yeah.
So that's kind of interesting. So it just wasn't on our radar here, I guess.
Yeah.
It'd be anyhow, but it was definitely obviously on some people's radars.
Well, thank you all for letting me
Thanks.
talk about history. Sorry about the technical difficulty.
Thank you for the brownie.